Hello, Night Seekers, and welcome to Lacuna Noir. This is where forgotten stories and gentle voices meet, carrying you softly into peaceful sleep, wrapped in mystery. Before tonight's tale begins, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if you're drawn to these quiet, shadowed nights, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss a story when darkness calls. Now, close your eyes, get comfortable, and let's drift into the unknown together. This happened in the late 1970s when my family was living on a small ranch south of San Antonio. It was quiet country, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, where nothing much happened without the whole area eventually hearing about it. Nights were dark in a way people who grow up in cities never really experience. No streetlights, no glow on the horizon, just stars and the sounds of insects, cattle, and the occasional distant coyote. Our nearest neighbor was a man named Frank. He lived alone on his ranch and kept to himself, but he wasn't strange or unfriendly. He was the kind of neighbor who waved when you passed, helped out when needed, and didn't talk more than necessary. Solid, practical, no nonsense. My dad respected him, and that mattered. One day, Frank came over and asked if we could help him unload a new bull he had just bought. It was a registered Brahman bull, expensive and impressive, the kind of animal you don't buy unless you're serious about your herd. Brahmins are big, muscular, tough animals, bred to handle heat and harsh conditions. They're not fragile livestock. We went over to help him unload the bull from the trailer. The animal's registered name was Cornelius, which felt oddly formal for such a massive, intimidating creature. He was huge, broad-shouldered, with that distinctive Brahmin hump and loose skin around the neck. He didn't seem sick or injured. If anything, he looked strong and alert, stamping and snorting as we guided him into the holding pen. The plan was to let the cows get used to him before fully integrating him into the herd. Everything went smoothly. No accidents, no strange behavior. We finished up, chatted a bit, and went home. It was just another normal ranch day. The next morning, Frank came back over, and right away, something felt off. He asked us if we had seen or heard anything unusual during the night. That alone was strange. Nights out there were usually predictable. Coyotes howling, maybe an owl, maybe cattle shifting around. Nothing that would raise alarms. We told him no. We hadn't heard a thing. Frank didn't say much after that, just nodded and asked us to come with him to his back pasture, the one that bordered our land. We followed him out there, and that's when we saw Cornelius. The bull was lying on his side, motionless. At first, I thought maybe he was sleeping or had gone down and couldn't get back up. But as we got closer, it was obvious he was dead. Completely still, no breathing, no movement. A massive animal, lifeless in the grass. What made it even stranger was the lack of any clear cause. There was no blood, no obvious wounds, no signs of a struggle, no broken fencing, no tracks that stood out. Just a few superficial scratches on his neck and hindquarters. Nothing that looked serious enough to kill a bull like that. Certainly nothing that looked like a predator attack. Everyone stood there quietly, trying to make sense of it. There was nothing in that area that should have been able to take down a full-grown Brahmin bull. No big cats, no bears. Coyotes wouldn't even try. Even if a pack did, there would have been blood, torn flesh, signs of a violent struggle. This was clean. Too clean. Frank didn't say much while we were there. He just looked shaken. Not panicked, not hysterical, just deeply unsettled. We eventually left him to deal with it, still confused, but assuming maybe there was some medical explanation, we just didn't understand. Later, my dad told us something that made the whole situation much harder to brush off. According to my dad, Frank claimed that he had seen something in that pasture the night Cornelius died. He said he saw a woman walking out there, a woman without a head. Frank told him this quietly, seriously, not as a joke, not laughing, not trying to scare anyone, just stating it as a fact. My dad made a point of telling us something else, too. Frank wasn't a drinker, not even a little. He didn't mess with drugs. He wasn't known for exaggeration or storytelling. He was steady, grounded, the kind of man who dealt in reality, not superstition. Frank said that after that night, he would never go into that pasture after dark again, and he didn't. The rest of the time we lived there, he avoided that part of his land once the sun went down. If something needed doing back there, it waited until morning. He warned us too, told us not to wander into that pasture at night, not to mess around, not to ignore it. We never saw the woman, headless or otherwise. We never heard anything strange ourselves. No screams, no footsteps, no voices. But after that, the pasture felt different. Even in daylight, there was a heaviness to it. At night, it was worse. The darkness there felt thicker, deeper somehow, like it swallowed sound instead of carrying it. As kids, we were creeped out. As adults, looking back, it still doesn't sit right. You can try to explain it away. Maybe the bull had an aneurysm or some rare condition. Maybe the scratches came from fencing or another animal after death. Maybe Frank saw something that wasn't really there, his mind filling in gaps after finding his prized bull dead for no apparent reason. But the problem is that none of those explanations fully fit. Healthy bulls don't just drop dead overnight without signs, especially not expensive, well cared for animals. And Frank's reaction wasn't dramatic enough to feel imagined. If anything, it was restrained, like he didn't want to talk about it more than necessary. What sticks with me is how his behavior changed afterward. He didn't make a big deal out of it publicly. He didn't tell stories around town. He didn't try to convince people. He just quietly adjusted his life to avoid that place after dark. People don't usually do that over something they don't believe themselves. We lived there for years after that, and nothing else like it ever happened. No more unexplained deaths, no sightings, no escalation. Just that one event, sitting there in memory like a loose thread that never got tied off. Even now, decades later, I still think about it sometimes. About Cornelius lying there with no clear reason. About Frank, a man who trusted his land and his routines, suddenly refusing to step into part of his own pasture once the sun went down. About the way he warned us without embellishment, without fear-mongering, just a quiet insistence. We never found out what really happened that night. All I know is that something killed a full-grown Brahmin bull without leaving the kind of evidence you'd expect. And a man who had lived on that land for years saw something that shook him enough to permanently change his habits. That's enough to make it stick with you. Some stories don't end with answers. They just sit there unsettling, reminding you that even in familiar places, things can happen that don't fit neatly into the rules you rely on. And once you've heard a warning like that, once it's been delivered by someone you trust, you don't forget it. We never saw the woman, but none of us ever forgot what Frank said. I was about 7 or 8 years old when this happened, back when my world was still small and everything felt bigger than it really was. Summers meant piling into the car with my family and driving out to places that felt exciting simply because they were different from home. One of those places was a man-made lake in South Georgia, a family park that tried very hard to feel like a beach, even though it was nothing more than a large pond dug into the ground. The owner had done everything he could to sell the illusion. He had trucked in pale sand and spread it thick along the shoreline, so your feet wouldn't touch mud right away. Palm trees were planted around the edges, some real and some that looked suspiciously fake, their leaves stiff and shiny in the sun. There was a small booth at the entrance where you paid to get in, and beyond that a wide open area where families parked their cars, unloaded coolers, and set up grills. Smoke from charcoal fires hung in the air all day, mixing with the smell of sunscreen, hot dogs, and lake water. People came early and stayed late. Parents laid out towels and folding chairs. Kids ran barefoot across the sand, dragging floaties behind them. Music played from car radios, sometimes overlapping into a strange mess of country songs and pop hits. It felt loud, busy, and alive in a way that only summer places feel when you're a kid. The lake itself was big enough to feel endless to me back then. The water wasn't clear like the ocean. It was dark, greenish and cloudy, the kind of water where you couldn't see your feet, even if you stood still and looked straight down. There was a shallow area near the shore where younger kids splashed around, but it dropped off faster than it should have. The adults didn't seem too concerned about safety. This was the kind of place where rules were loose and supervision was more about yelling names than actually watching closely. On one side of the lake stood a tall metal water slide that looked exciting and terrifying at the same time. It was steep, rusty in places, and definitely not designed with safety in mind. Kids climbed up it all day, burning their legs on the hot metal steps and flying down to the water at the bottom. Everyone knew someone who had gotten scraped, bruised, or knocked the wind out of them on that slide. It was just accepted as part of the fun. My family always parked in the same general spot, near a section of shoreline that faced a small island in the middle of the lake. Calling it an island might be generous. It was really just a clump of sand and dirt that rose slightly above the water, maybe 30 yards from shore. A few scraggly plants grew there, and sometimes kids would climb onto it and stand around like explorers who had discovered new land. I wasn't a strong swimmer. I could swim enough to keep myself afloat, but I wasn't confident, and deep water made me nervous. Still, the water between the shore and that little island was just barely over my head. If I timed it right, I could bounce along the bottom, pushing off with my feet, popping up for air, and then sinking down again. It felt like a game, like I was cheating my way across without really swimming. I had done it before without any problems. That day, the sun was bright, the water warm, and I felt brave enough to try again. I remember stepping into the lake, feeling the sand shift under my feet, and slowly moving farther out. The sounds from the shore faded a little as the water reached my ears. I focused on the rhythm of it. Step, push, pop up, breathe, sink, repeat. I was about halfway there when it happened. As I came down from one of those little hops, my foot landed on something that didn't feel like sand or rock. It was soft, but not squishy like mud. There was shape to it. My toes brushed against something firm and rounded, and for a split second, my brain didn't understand what I was feeling. Then it registered. It felt like a face. More specifically, it felt like my toe had pressed against a nose. The realization hit me all at once, sharp and electric. Before I could even react, my foot shifted slightly, and I felt something else. Hair. Fine hair floating freely in the water. slipping and waving between my toes. It wasn't tangled or thick. It was soft, individual strands moving with the current, unmistakably hair. I froze in place, my heart slamming so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. My body reacted before my mind could catch up. I kicked upward, gasping for air, and flailed my way back toward the shore. I don't remember swimming properly. I just remember panic, the water splashing into my mouth, and the desperate need to get away from whatever was under me. When I reached the shallow area, I stumbled out of the water and collapsed onto the sand. My hands were shaking. My breathing came in short, sharp bursts. I remember staring at my feet, half expecting to see something clinging to them, some physical proof of what I had just felt. But there was nothing. I didn't scream. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. I was a little kid, and my brain didn't know how to process it. All I knew was that something about that water had scared me in a way I had never been scared before. I wrapped myself in a towel and sat on the shore, refusing to go back in. Time passed, though I don't know how much. When you're a kid, minutes and hours blur together. I watched other children splash and laugh. I watched people climb the water slide and disappear into the lake. I tried to convince myself that I had imagined it, that it had been a log or a weird rock or something harmless. Then I heard the yelling. At first, it blended into the usual noise of the place. Parents were always shouting for their kids, but this was different. The voices were sharper, more frantic. I heard a man calling out a name over and over again, his voice cracking with fear. A woman joined in, her voice high and desperate. Other adults started looking around, asking questions, scanning the water. The mood of the entire place shifted. Laughter faded. Music was turned down. People stood up from their chairs and shaded their eyes, trying to see across the lake. Someone asked if anyone had seen a little boy. Someone else said he had been swimming near the island. My stomach dropped. I watched as adults waded into the water near that small clump of sand. A few men dove under, coming back up empty-handed, shaking their heads. The shouting grew louder, more panicked. I remember gripping the edge of my towel so tightly my fingers hurt. Then someone screamed. They pulled him up from under the water right there, in front of that island. His body broke the surface slowly, heavy and limp. I didn't understand everything I was seeing, but I understood enough. The way the adults reacted, the way some people turned away, the way others rushed forward. The boy wasn't moving. I don't remember his face clearly. I don't remember his clothes. What I remember is the stillness of him, the unnatural way his body seemed to float once it was released. I remember the adults carrying him toward the shore, their expressions grim and pale. No one had to explain it to me. I knew with a sick certainty what I had stepped on, the face, the nose, the hair drifting between my toes. That was him. The realization settled over me like a weight. I felt cold even though the sun was still hot. I felt small and helpless and deeply unsettled in a way that went beyond fear. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I just sat there, staring at the water, replaying that sensation over and over in my mind. We left not long after that. I don't remember the drive home. I don't remember what my parents said, if anything. I don't remember asking questions or being comforted. It was as if my mind sealed the event away, locking it behind a door marked, "Do not open." But some things don't stay locked forever. I'm 47 years old now. I've lived a full life since then. I've had joys and losses, good memories and bad ones. I've been scared in other ways, faced real dangers, experienced grief and stress and all the things that come with growing up. And still, all these years later, I can remember that moment with perfect clarity. I can remember the exact feeling of that hair moving between my toes, soft and weightless, alive in the water even though the body it belonged to was not. I can remember the shape of that face beneath my foot, the wrongness of it being there, unseen and silent. That memory has never faded. It doesn't come with images so much as sensations. Sometimes it surfaces when I'm swimming in dark water. Sometimes when my feet touch something unexpected. Sometimes for no reason at all, late at night when my mind wanders back to childhood. I don't know that boy's name. I never learned what happened afterward, how his family coped, or how the park handled it. I only know that for a brief, horrifying moment, our lives crossed in a way that left a permanent mark on me. Some memories stay with you because they were happy. Others stay because they taught you something important. And then there are the ones that stay because they remind you how thin the line is between ordinary moments and tragedy. That day at the lake started like any other summer outing. It ended with a feeling I have never been able to forget, a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying things are the ones you don't see until it's far too late. In the mid-1970s, in a quiet part of Alberta, there was an old farm that most people had forgotten about. The land had once been worked, the buildings once used daily, but by that time it sat abandoned and slowly falling apart. Nature was beginning to reclaim it. Wood rotted, metal rusted, and weeds grew tall around structures that no longer served a purpose. It was the kind of place people drove past without thinking twice, never imagining that something terrible was hidden beneath the ground. In 1975, a couple living nearby owned that old farm. They no longer used it, but it was still their property. One day, they realized they needed a pump for their septic tank. Buying a new one would cost money, and they remembered that the abandoned farm still had an old septic system. The pump there might still work. It seemed like a simple, practical solution. They decided to go out to the old farm and retrieve it. There was nothing unusual about the trip at first. It was just another task, another chore. The buildings were quiet, the land empty. The septic tank was buried, as it always is, hidden from view. When they opened it and began working, they expected to find nothing more than waste and decay. Septic tanks are unpleasant by nature, but predictable. What they did not expect was to uncover something that would haunt investigators and the public for decades. Inside the tank, instead of just sewage, they found a human body. The shock of that moment is hard to imagine. This was not a recent death. The body had been there for a long time, submerged in chemicals and waste, hidden away where no one would think to look. The couple immediately contacted authorities. What had started as a simple attempt to save money turned into the discovery of one of the most disturbing murder cases in Canadian history. When police arrived and recovered the body, it quickly became clear that this was not an accident. This was not someone who had fallen in or died naturally. The man had been murdered, and the violence inflicted on him before his death was extreme. The victim was male, but identifying him was nearly impossible at the time. The conditions inside the septic tank had destroyed many of the usual clues investigators rely on. Fingerprints were gone, facial features were badly damaged, clothing offered little help. For years, he would be known only by a nickname given to him by the media and investigators, a name that reduced a human life to the place where he had been hidden. As investigators examined the remains, the true horror of what had happened slowly emerged. This man had not simply been killed, he had been tortured. Evidence showed that he had suffered severe physical abuse before his death. Even more disturbing was the clear sign of sexual mutilation. The injuries were deliberate, cruel, and meant to cause pain and humiliation. This was not random violence. It was personal, prolonged, and intentional. After the torture, the man was shot. The gunshot was what ultimately killed him, but death had not come quickly or mercifully. By the time he was shot, he had already endured unimaginable suffering. Once he was dead, his body was disposed of in the septic tank of the abandoned farm, a place chosen precisely because it was isolated and unlikely to be disturbed. Whoever did this believed the body would never be found. At the time, investigators worked with the tools available to them in the 1970s. They examined dental records, missing persons reports, and any physical detail they could recover. They estimated the man's age, height, and general appearance. They tried to reconstruct what little they could of his face. They followed leads, interviewed people, and searched for anyone who might match the description. But nothing led to a name. Years passed, and the case grew cold. Files were boxed up. Detectives retired. New cases took priority. The man in the septic tank remained unidentified, a victim without a past, a story without a beginning. His murder became one of those cases that linger quietly in the background, occasionally mentioned, but never resolved. Despite this, the case never completely disappeared. Advances in forensic science slowly changed what was possible. DNA testing, which did not exist in any useful form in 1975, became more advanced and more accessible. Over time, investigators revisited old cases, including this one, hoping that new technology could succeed where earlier methods had failed. For decades, the victim's identity remained unknown. He had no name, no confirmed family, no official history that could be attached to him. He existed only as evidence in a case file and as a memory of violence. It was as if his life before his death had been erased entirely. Then, in 2021, everything changed. Through modern forensic genealogy, investigators were finally able to identify the man. By comparing DNA from the remains with genetic databases and family trees, they traced his lineage backward. Piece by piece, a real person emerged from the anonymity. After 46 years, the victim was given his name back. For the first time, he was no longer just a body found in a septic tank. He was someone's child, someone's relative, someone who had lived a life before it ended in brutality. The identification was a major breakthrough, but it also reopened old wounds and raised painful questions. Who had he been in life? How had he ended up in Alberta? Why had someone targeted him with such extreme cruelty? And most importantly, who had done this to him? Despite the identification, the murder itself remains unsolved. The person or people responsible for the torture, mutilation, and killing have never been brought to justice. They may be dead. They may still be alive. They may have lived normal lives, carrying the secret for decades. The silence surrounding the crime is almost as disturbing as the violence itself. What makes this case especially haunting is the level of suffering involved. This was not a crime of impulse or panic. The injuries show planning and intent. The victim was held, hurt, and dehumanized before being killed. The disposal of the body suggests forethought, an attempt to erase evidence and deny the victim even the dignity of being found. For years, he lay in darkness, submerged and forgotten, while the world moved on above him. Seasons changed. People lived their lives. The farm decayed. And beneath it all, the truth waited. Cases like this force uncomfortable reflections. They remind us how easily a person can vanish, how violence can erase identity, and how justice is not always swift or guaranteed. They also show the limits of human knowledge at any given time. In 1975, investigators did everything they could, but the tools simply weren't there. It took nearly half a century for science to catch up. Even now, with the victim identified, the story remains incomplete. There is no arrest, no trial, no clear explanation for why this happened. The man's final hours are still largely unknown, imagined only through the injuries left behind. For his family, learning the truth must have been devastating. To discover not only that a loved one died, but that he suffered so terribly, and that his killer was never caught, is a burden few people can truly understand. Closure, in cases like this, is never complete. The abandoned farm is no longer just an old piece of land. It is a crime scene frozen in time, a place tied forever to what was hidden there. The septic tank, meant to hold waste, became a grave, a place chosen specifically to make a human being disappear. And yet, despite the attempt to erase him, the victim was eventually found. He was identified. His existence was acknowledged. In that sense, the plan to hide the crime forever failed. Still, justice remains unfinished. The case stands as a reminder that some crimes leave scars not only on victims and families, but on entire communities. It shows how cruelty can exist quietly, unnoticed, until chance brings it into the light. It also shows how the past is never truly gone. Even decades later, it can rise back to the surface, demanding to be seen and remembered. The man found in that septic tank is no longer unknown, but his story is still waiting for its final chapter. Until the truth is fully uncovered and revealed, the case remains open, a dark and unsettling reminder of how much can be hidden in plain sight, and how long the dead can wait to be heard. When I was younger, my mother worked in a prison. It wasn't the kind of job people usually imagine when they think of prisons. She wasn't a guard, and she didn't wear a uniform or carry keys or walk cell blocks all day. She worked in the education department, teaching and handling paperwork, helping inmates with basic learning programs and assessments. Still, the building was the same one everyone else worked in, with the same locked doors, echoing corridors, and heavy atmosphere that never really lets you forget where you are. Part of the prison included a wing for vulnerable prisoners. Even as a kid, I understood that meant inmates who couldn't be housed with the general population because of what they had done, or because they would be targeted by others. My mother never talked about details back then. She kept her work life and home life very separate, or at least she tried to. I just knew she came home tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. At the time, my sister and I were young, full of energy, and mostly unaware of the darker parts of the world. We played outside, scraped our knees, argued over toys, and thought about school, friends, and what was for dinner. Our lives were normal and safe, and my mother worked very hard to keep it that way. There was a period when something small but strange changed in our household. My mother suddenly became very strict about our hair. Up until then, ponytails had been an everyday thing. They were easy, practical, and perfect for kids who ran around and didn't want hair in their faces. But one morning, as she was getting us ready, she stopped us. She told us we weren't allowed to wear our hair in ponytails anymore. At first, I thought it was just one of those random parent rules that don't make sense to kids. I asked why, and she brushed it off, saying she just preferred it down for now. My sister accepted it more easily, but I didn't. I was a tomboy through and through. I climbed trees, played rough, and hated anything that felt fussy or uncomfortable. Wearing my hair down annoyed me. It got in my face, stuck to my neck when I sweated, and felt like it was always in the way. For a while, I did what she asked, even though I complained constantly. She was firm about it in a way that felt different from normal rules. There was no room for negotiation, no joking tone, no, just because I said so. It felt serious, heavy, like there was something behind it she wasn't saying. Eventually, my frustration won out. I begged her to let me cut my hair short. If I couldn't tie it up, I didn't want it long at all. After some hesitation, she agreed. We went and had it cut, and once it was short enough, the issue disappeared. I was relieved, and she seemed relieved too, though I didn't understand why at the time. Life moved on. The hair rule faded into the background, becoming just another odd memory from childhood. I didn't question it anymore. Kids don't always notice the reasons behind adult behavior, especially when adults are trying to shield them from something. Years later, when I was older, the subject came up again. We were talking about her old job, about how difficult it had been, and how some things had stayed with her long after she left. By then, I was mature enough to understand more, and she trusted me enough to explain what she never could when I was a child. She told me that around the time she stopped us from wearing our hair in ponytails, a new inmate had arrived in the vulnerable prisoner's wing. What he had done was so disturbing that even now, thinking about it makes my stomach tighten. He had harmed his own young daughter in a way no child should ever be harmed. The details were horrific, and my mother didn't dwell on them, but the truth was clear enough. The child didn't survive. Afterward, he tried to hide what he had done, treating her body like something to be disposed of rather than a human being. He was caught in the process, which is how the crime came to light. This man was now in the same building where my mother worked every day. Because of the nature of his crime, he couldn't be housed with most other inmates. People like him are not forgiven or forgotten behind prison walls. That's why he was placed in the vulnerable wing, where staff like my mother still had to interact with him in professional, controlled settings. She told me that what made it even harder was the way he talked. Sometimes, during sessions or casual interactions related to her work, he would speak about his daughter. He referred to her in possessive terms, calling her his girl, as if she were something he owned rather than a child he had destroyed. He talked about her appearance, about how pretty she was, about small, specific details that should never have been spoken aloud. One thing in particular stuck with my mother and lodged itself deep in her mind. He talked about the back of her neck. He spoke about how he noticed it, how delicate it was, how seeing young girls with their hair tied up exposed that part of them. He described how that sight affected him, how it drew his attention, how it made him feel. He talked about grabbing hair, about control, about vulnerability, all in a way that made it clear he was not remorseful, not ashamed, and not changed. My mother had to sit there and listen to this, maintaining professionalism, keeping her reactions hidden, doing her job while every instinct in her body screamed at her to get away. Then she would come home. She would walk through our front door and see her own children. Two little girls, safe, laughing, unaware, and sometimes she would see us with our hair tied back, ponytails bouncing as we ran around the house. She told me that she couldn't handle it. Seeing our hair up made her think of his words. It made her picture the way he talked about children, the way he fixated on small, innocent details and twisted them into something monstrous. She knew logically that we were safe. She knew he was locked away. But trauma doesn't listen to logic. In her mind, the image of ponytails had become tangled with the things he said and the things he did. She couldn't look at us like that without feeling sick, without imagining danger where none existed. It wasn't about control or appearance. It was about fear, disgust, and a desperate need to protect us from a world she had seen too clearly. So she made us wear our hair down. Not because it truly made us safer, but because it made her feel like she was doing something, anything, to put distance between her children and the kind of person she dealt with at work. It was a small act of control in a situation where she felt powerless. When she told me all this, I finally understood the tension I had felt back then, the seriousness in her voice, the way she never explained herself. She wasn't being strict for no reason. She was coping the only way she knew how. Working in that environment changed her. It exposed her to the worst things people can do to each other, and more painfully, to children. She carried those stories home with her, whether she wanted to or not. Even when she tried to leave work at work, some of it followed her, slipping into her thoughts, her fears, and her parenting. Looking back now, I don't feel angry about the rule or confused by it. I feel sad for her. Sad that she had to hear those things. Sad that she had to look at someone capable of such cruelty and then come home and pretend that the world was still simple and safe. I also feel grateful. Grateful that she cared enough to be affected. Grateful that she was so deeply protective of us, even when the threat wasn't real or immediate. Grateful that she did everything she could to keep our childhood untouched by the darkness she saw every day. As a child, I hated wearing my hair down. As an adult, I understand that it was never really about hair at all. It was about a mother trying to shield her children from something she could never fully forget, something that had permanently changed the way she saw the world. Some jobs leave marks you can't see. They don't show up as scars or injuries, but as quiet habits, sudden rules, and moments of fear that don't make sense until much later. This was one of those marks, a small, strange rule born from something unimaginably terrible, carried silently by a woman who just wanted her children to stay innocent for as long as possible. The girl I knew wasn't answering her phone. I kept calling. I kept texting. Nothing. At first, I thought she might just be busy or ignoring me, but the longer it went on, the worse the feeling in my chest got. Finally, my phone buzzed. She answered, and her voice sounded wrong right away. Low. Tight. Like she was trying not to panic. She told me she was locked inside some guy's dorm room at UMBC. For a second, my brain didn't fully process the words. Locked. Dorm room. Campus. Then everything hit at once. I asked her where exactly she was, what happened, if she was hurt. She said the guy wouldn't let her leave and that she didn't know what to do. I could hear fear in her voice, the kind that makes your stomach drop because you know it's real. She handed the phone to him. I don't even remember exactly what he said first, just that his tone was calm in a way that felt wrong, too controlled, too casual for the situation. I told him to let her go. He talked back. We started arguing. It escalated fast. I told him I was on my way and that this wasn't going to end well for him if he didn't unlock that door immediately. I got in my car and drove straight to campus, adrenaline flooding my system. Every red light felt like it was mocking me. My hands were tight on the steering wheel. I kept replaying her voice in my head, the fear in it, and imagining all the ways this could go bad. While I was still on the way, she called again. She said she had gotten out. She didn't explain how, just that she was free and scared and wanted to leave. When I got there, I picked her up and the relief hit me so hard I almost felt dizzy. I wanted to go find him. I wanted to confront him face to face. I wanted answers. She begged me not to. She said he was really creepy, that something about him felt off in a way she couldn't explain, and that she just wanted to get as far away from campus as possible. So I listened to her. At the time, I thought that was the end of it. A close call, a bad situation that could have been worse, something scary but contained. I had no idea it was only the beginning. A couple of days later, I got a message on AOL Instant Messenger. AIM was still a normal thing back then, something everyone used without thinking twice. The screen name wasn't familiar, but the message made my blood run cold almost instantly. It was him. He knew who I was. He knew my full legal name. He knew my address. He started threatening me, threatening the girl, saying things that were meant to scare me. And the thing was, this was 2005. You couldn't just casually look someone up online the way you can now. Social media wasn't what it is today. The fact that he had that information felt invasive and unsettling in a way that's hard to explain now. At first, I was angry more than scared. I told him to back off. He escalated. He said he would kill me. He said he would kill her. He talked like he was enjoying it, like the fear itself was the point. I called his bluff. I told him that if he wanted to meet up, I was ready any time. I figured he was just a keyboard warrior, someone who felt powerful hiding behind a screen. People talked big online back then, too, and most of them never did anything in real life. I assumed this was the same thing. A disturbed guy trying to intimidate me because I had challenged him. The messages eventually stopped. Weeks passed. Life moved on. The incident faded into the background, something I thought about occasionally, but didn't dwell on. I didn't know his name. I didn't know anything about his life beyond that brief, terrifying interaction. I assumed I'd never hear from him again. Then the news broke. He had gone on a date with a woman he met through MySpace. What happened to her was beyond horrific. He raped her. He murdered her. He mutilated her body in an attempt to make her harder to identify. The details were brutal. The kind that stick in your head whether you want them to or not. When I saw his name, it felt like the air left the room. It was the same guy, the same voice, the same presence. The same person who had locked a girl in his dorm room, the same person who had threatened me and shown me he knew where I lived. Suddenly, all of it made sense in the worst possible way. This wasn't someone pretending to be dangerous. He was dangerous. He eventually pleaded guilty to avoid the death penalty. That was how the case ended in the legal sense. But for the people connected to it, there was no real ending. Just damage that spread outward in ways no one could fully measure. What haunts me the most is how close it all was. How easily things could have gone differently. If the girl I knew hadn't gotten out when she did, if I had arrived later, if someone else hadn't said no, or trusted the wrong person, or brushed off a bad feeling. Back then, online dating still felt new and experimental. MySpace profiles were casual, messy, personal in a way people didn't yet understand the risks of. We shared photos, interests, locations, without thinking about who might be watching or what they might do with that information. There wasn't the same awareness, the same caution, the same warnings people grow up with now. He used that. He used the access, the anonymity, the trust people extended because they didn't yet know how dangerous it could be. And he didn't just fantasize about violence. He acted on it. Looking back, I replay those AIM messages in my head, the confidence in his threats, the way he seemed energized by confrontation. At the time, I thought standing my ground made me strong. Now I understand how lucky I was that he never followed through on those threats toward me or the girl I knew. Luck is a hard thing to sit with when someone else didn't have it. The woman he killed didn't get a warning. She didn't have someone calling her phone nonstop. She didn't have a chance to get out and be picked up and driven away. She went on a date, expecting something normal, maybe awkward, maybe forgettable. Instead, she crossed paths with someone who should never have been free to hurt anyone again. When people talk about true crime cases, they often focus on the killer, the nickname, the headlines. But for those of us who brushed up against the edges of it, it's quieter and more personal. It's the what-ifs, the moments that didn't seem important at the time, the memories that suddenly rearrange themselves when you learn the truth. Sometimes I think about how easily I dismissed the danger because it came through a screen. How easy it was to believe that real violence existed somewhere else. Not in my life, not in my circle. That illusion didn't survive this. This happened before constant news alerts, before social media feeds filled with true crime stories every day. It unfolded slowly, through articles, conversations, and shock, spreading through people who realized something monstrous had been living just beneath the surface of ordinary life. Even now, years later, it still doesn't feel completely real. Just a series of moments that line up too perfectly to ignore. A locked dorm room. A threatening message. A name in the news. And the heavy understanding that sometimes, when your instincts tell you something is wrong, they're not being dramatic. They're trying to keep you alive. I don't think about him often, and when I do, I try not to give him more space than he deserves. But I do think about the girl I knew, and how close she came to being another headline. I think about the woman who didn't get away, and I think about how easily all of this could have stayed hidden if things had gone just a little differently. Some stories don't announce themselves as horror while you're living them. They only reveal what they really were when you look back and realize how close you were to the edge. Sorry to pause for just a moment. If this is your first time here, welcome. I hope you're enjoying the calm so far. If you'd like more nights like this, true stories, gentle rain, no interruptions, please subscribe to Lacuna Noir. It really helps me keep creating these peaceful experiences for you. And tap the bell so you're here every time a new story arrives in the dark. Now, back to the story. A friend of mine in high school was murdered by someone with their car. He was walking home wasted after a party. That sentence still feels unreal to write, even all these years later. At the time, it didn't feel like something that could actually happen to someone I knew. Things like that were supposed to happen somewhere else, to people you only heard about on the news, not to a kid who sat a few rows away from you in class and laughed at the same dumb jokes everyone else did. We were teenagers in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place where parents felt safe, letting their kids walk home at night. Streets were lined with trees and modest houses, most with porch lights left on out of habit rather than necessity. People waved at each other. Everyone recognized familiar cars. It wasn't the kind of area where you expected violence, especially not something so deliberate and cruel. The night it happened started like so many others. There had been a party, nothing unusual for high school. Loud music, cheap alcohol, kids trying to act older than they were. My friend drank too much, more than he should have, but again, that wasn't shocking. He wasn't reckless by nature. He was just young, caught up in the moment. thinking the night would end the same way all the others did. Instead of staying over or calling someone, he decided to walk home. His house wasn't far, just a few streets away through his own neighborhood. He knew the route by heart. He had walked it dozens of times before, sober and not. It was familiar, safe, routine. He never made it home. The next morning, the news spread fast. At first, details were vague and confusing. People said there had been an accident, a hit and run. Someone had been found on the side of the road. When his name finally came out, it felt like the air was sucked out of the room. Teachers stopped lessons mid-sentence. Students whispered in hallways, eyes wide, voices low. Some cried openly. Others went quiet, like their brains refused to accept what they were hearing. Then the details came out, and everything got worse. The autopsy showed injuries that were consistent with the car slowly crushing him. Not a sudden impact, not a quick accidental strike. The medical examiner said the vehicle was likely moving under 10 miles per hour, slow enough that the driver knew exactly what they were doing, slow enough that this wasn't a moment of panic or loss of control. Even more horrifying, the autopsy showed that he had been run over twice. Twice. Not once, not in a split second of chaos, but deliberately, methodically. Whoever was behind the wheel didn't just hit him and flee. They drove over him, then turned around and did it again, just as slowly. The kind of injuries he had didn't come from speed. They came from pressure, weight, intent. It didn't kill him instantly. That fact is the hardest part to sit with even now. After being run over, after his body was broken, in ways no one should ever have to experience, he was still alive. Somehow, through shock and pain that's impossible to imagine, he managed to crawl to the side of the road. Investigators believe he probably lived for hours. Hours in the dark. Hours alone. Hours in excruciating pain, with crushed bones, internal injuries, and no help coming. He must have been terrified, confused, drifting in and out of consciousness, not understanding why no one was stopping, why no one was coming. It's unbearable to think about what went through his mind during that time, what he might have tried to do, what hope he might have held on to before his body finally gave out. By the time he was found, it was too late. The community was shattered. Parents pulled their kids closer. Porch lights stayed on all night. People locked doors they hadn't locked in years. Everyone wanted answers, and everyone assumed they would come quickly. After all, this hadn't happened on a highway or some isolated back road. It happened deep inside his own neighborhood. This wasn't a stranger passing through. This wasn't someone speeding in from somewhere else and disappearing into the night. Whoever did this knew the area. They were driving slowly, comfortably, like someone who belonged there. It could have been the someone who lived a few houses away, someone who waved at neighbors, someone who still walks those same streets, still parks their car in their driveway, still lives a normal life. That's what made it even more disturbing. Despite the brutality of the crime, despite the clear evidence that this was intentional, they never found out who did it. There were no arrests, no suspects, no dramatic breakthroughs. The investigation went on. Leads were followed. Tips were called in. But nothing stuck. Not a single person was ever charged. People tried to make sense of it in their own ways. Some said maybe it was road rage that escalated beyond control. Others thought it might have been someone who recognized him. Someone who had a grudge. Someone who panicked and made unforgivable choices. But there was no proof. No witnesses who saw enough. No cameras back then to capture license plates or movements. Just a broken body and a trail that went cold almost immediately. Over time, the case faded from headlines, but it never faded from the people who knew him. Every time someone walked that stretch of road, they thought about it. Every time a car drove by slowly at night, people wondered. Parents warned their kids. Friends replayed memories, searching for signs they might have missed. What's chilling is the idea that the person responsible may still be there, still living in that neighborhood, still driving the same streets, still passing the spot where it happened. Maybe they've convinced themselves it was an accident. Maybe they buried it so deep they barely think about it anymore. Or maybe they think about it every day and are just very good at hiding it. There was no closure. Graduation came, as it always does. His name was mentioned. There was a moment of silence. People cried again. Then life moved forward, unevenly, awkwardly, the way it does after something terrible. New classes started, new students arrived. The desks he once sat in were filled by someone else. But for those of us who knew him, the story never really ended. Years later, it still comes up sometimes, usually late at night, usually after someone mentions true crime or unsolved cases. Someone will say his name, and the room will go quiet. The same questions resurface. How could someone do that? How could they never be caught? How could a neighborhood hold a secret like that for so long? The scariest part isn't just the violence. It's the ordinariness surrounding it. This didn't happen in a dark alley or a dangerous part of town. It happened where people felt safe. It happened slowly. It happened quietly. And it was done by someone who blended in so well that they were never identified. There's something deeply unsettling about knowing that justice never came, that the person who did this never had to answer for it, that my friend never got the dignity of having his story fully told in a courtroom, never had someone stand up and say, "This is what happened, and this is who is responsible." Instead, all that remains are facts that feel more like nightmares than reality. A drunk walk home, a slow-moving car, a deliberate act, a long, painful death, and a neighborhood that still looks peaceful on the surface, hiding something unspeakable underneath. When people talk about murder, they often imagine rage, chaos, speed. This wasn't that. This was slow, intentional, thoughtful in the most horrifying way. The kind of crime that forces you to confront the idea that evil doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like a car idling down a familiar street at night. I still think about him, about how young he was, about how unfair it all was, about how his life ended, not with help or comfort, but alone on the side of a road he had walked so many times before. And I think about the person who did it, still out there somewhere, living with what they did, or worse, living as if it never mattered. Some stories don't have endings. They just linger, unresolved, heavy, refusing to be forgotten. This is one of them. My grandparents were Dutch immigrants living in New Zealand. And by the 1970s, they had settled into a quiet, hard-working life. They weren't adventurous people by nature. But like many families back then, they enjoyed simple pleasures. One of those was taking their caravan out for short camping trips, especially during school holidays. It was their way of giving the kids something fun and memorable without spending much money. At that time, my mom and her siblings were all young, 10 years old or younger. To them, these trips felt like real adventures. Piling into the car, towing the caravan behind them, heading out of town and into places that felt wild and unexplored. My grandparents liked rural areas, places that reminded them a little of the countryside they'd grown up around in Europe, even though New Zealand's landscape was far more dense and unfamiliar. On this particular trip, they drove out into a very remote part of the North Island. It wasn't a campground with marked sites or nearby facilities. It was the kind of place people used to camp freely back then, near a lake surrounded by thick rainforest. The trees were tall and packed closely together, blocking out light even during the day. At night, it became a completely different world. They parked the caravan not far from the lake, surrounded by trees on almost all sides. During the day, everything felt peaceful. Birds, insects, the sound of water in the distance. The kids ran around, explored, got dirty, and eventually wore themselves out completely. After dinner, one by one, they fell asleep inside the caravan, curled up in bunks and makeshift beds. My grandparents stayed awake a little longer. That part of the night was normal. They sat quietly, reading, talking softly, having a cup of tea. The caravan was small, cozy, lit by a dim light. Outside, the forest had gone completely dark. There was no nearby road, no houses, no artificial light of any kind. At first, everything felt fine. Then they started hearing noises. It wasn't loud or obvious at first. Just small sounds that could easily be explained away. A twig snapping somewhere nearby. What sounded like movement through leaves. A pause. Then another sound. The kind of noises that make you stop reading and listen without realizing you've done it. They told themselves it was nothing. Animals, probably. The rainforest was full of them. Possums, birds, maybe even wild pigs further out. When you're camping, you expect noises like that. Still, something about it felt different. The sounds didn't have a clear rhythm. They didn't move away. They seemed to circle. At one point, my grandmother thought she heard a hushed voice. Not clear words, just the suggestion of one. My grandfather dismissed it gently, saying it was probably their imagination. Being in the middle of nowhere can play tricks on your mind, especially in complete darkness. They tried to laugh it off, but the tension didn't fully go away. They turned off the light and tried to settle down. My grandfather later told me that he couldn't sleep at all. His body was tired, but his mind wouldn't shut off. Every small noise felt amplified. The caravan creaked slightly as it cooled. The forest seemed alive in a way that made him uneasy. He lay there listening, counting seconds between sounds, telling himself he was being ridiculous. Then he heard it. A clear, unmistakable footstep right outside the caravan door. Not a rustle, not an animal moving through undergrowth. A solid step, close enough that it sounded like someone had deliberately placed their foot down. His heart started pounding immediately. He held his breath and listened. More footsteps followed. Slow, careful. Not running, not crashing through bushes. Whoever it was knew where they were going. He carefully leaned up and peeked through the small window near the door. Outside, it was pitch black. There was no moon that night. No stars visible through the thick canopy. He couldn't see shapes or outlines clearly, but he saw one thing. A small orange glow hovering at about chest height, just a few feet from the door. It was the lit end of a cigarette. That detail alone terrified him more than anything else could have. Animals don't smoke. This wasn't imagination or paranoia. There was a person standing right outside their caravan door. Judging by the height of the cigarette, it was a tall man. He wasn't moving. He wasn't knocking. He was just standing there, close enough to touch the door. At the same time, my grandfather could still hear other footsteps, more than one set. Movement further out, shifting positions, circling. Whoever was smoking stood completely still, like he was waiting. My grandfather later said that in that moment he felt a level of fear he had never experienced before or since. Not panic, not confusion, but a deep, heavy certainty that something was very wrong. Inside the caravan were his wife and 4 small children, all asleep and completely defenseless. Running wasn't an option. Pretending nothing was happening wasn't an option either. He needed to do something. He reached for the butcher's knife he had brought with him. He was a butcher by trade and always carried his own knives, even on trips where it made no sense. At the time, it had just been habit. In that moment, it felt like the only thing standing between his family and whatever was outside. His hands were shaking as he stood up. He took a breath, told himself he had to be brave, and unlocked the door. His plan wasn't clear. Maybe he would shout. Maybe he would scare them off. Maybe he would confront them and hope they backed away. He later admitted he didn't really think past opening the door. When he swung it open, the night air rushed in. There was no one there, no footsteps, no voices, no movement at all. The forest was suddenly silent, unnaturally so, as if everything had frozen. He stepped down carefully, knife still in his hand, heart racing, eyes straining to see anything in the darkness. Then he saw it. On the ground right outside the door was a cigarette butt, still warm, recently finished. That was enough. He didn't question it. He didn't try to investigate further. He didn't wake the kids to explain. He went straight back inside, woke my grandmother quietly, and told her they were leaving immediately. Luckily, he had already planned to start driving early the next morning, so most things were packed and ready. They moved fast but quietly. The kids were half asleep, confused but compliant. Within minutes, they were in the car, the caravan hitched, pulling away from the lake and into the darkness of the road. My grandfather didn't slow down until they reached an area closer to a town, where there were lights and other people. Only then did he stop and let himself breathe. They never went back to that spot. He never found out who was outside that caravan or what they wanted. He never heard anything in the news. No reports, no explanations. Just a night that ended with a cigarette butt on the ground and a feeling that they had escaped something they were never meant to understand. When he told me this story years later, his voice was steady, but his eyes weren't. He didn't exaggerate. He didn't speculate wildly. He just told it exactly as it happened, and that made it even more unsettling. What scares me the most isn't just the idea of strangers in the dark. It's how quiet it all was. No threats, no confrontation, just presence, just waiting, and the knowledge that if my grandfather hadn't looked out that window when he did, or if he had ignored his instincts, the story might have ended very differently. Every time I think about it, I imagine that glowing cigarette in the darkness, right outside a caravan full of sleeping children, in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by rainforest that would swallow sound and evidence without a trace. And I understand why my grandfather never went camping like that again. I was 16 at the time, barely old enough to drive on my own, and still felt like I was pretending every time I sat behind the wheel. I had just gotten my license, the plastic still new, the responsibility still unreal. Driving felt less like freedom and more like something fragile, like one wrong move would expose how little I actually knew about the world. There was a girl I was close to at school. Everyone knew her. She was the kind of girl people called boy crazy, though that label never felt fair to me. She was popular, confident on the surface, the type teachers remembered and guys competed over. She liked athletes, loud, confident guys, the kind who filled rooms without trying. I was not that. I was the nerdy kid, quiet, awkward, always on the outside of that social circle. She wasn't interested in me romantically, and I knew it. That part hurt. but it didn't ruin what we had. We were close in a different way. She trusted me. She talked to me when things got heavy, when she felt overwhelmed or confused or scared. She would message me late at night, pouring out everything she was dealing with, and then delete the messages afterward. She told me it was because the guys she dated were possessive, always checking her phone, always wanting control. At the time, I didn't fully understand how dangerous that could be. I just knew she needed someone who would listen and not judge. One winter night, long after I should have been asleep, my phone rang. That alone was strange. People didn't really call like that, especially not her, and especially not on a school night. It was late enough that the house was completely quiet. The kind of silence where every small sound feels loud. I answered, already uneasy. Her voice was barely above a whisper. It was shaking, uneven, like she was trying not to cry or scream. She asked me if I could come pick her up. She didn't explain much. She just said she needed to leave, that something was wrong. Before I could ask questions, she gave me an address and told me what to bring. Clothes, a shirt, underwear, sweats. Then she hung up. I stood there in the dark, phone still in my hand, heart racing. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't know what. There was no time to think it through. I didn't wake my parents. I didn't tell anyone. I just moved. This was before GPS, before smartphones telling you exactly where to go. I barely knew how to get to school without second-guessing myself, let alone another city. I sat at the family computer, hands shaking, and printed out directions from MapQuest, turn by turn, street names I'd never heard before. I folded the paper and stuffed it into my pocket like it was a lifeline. I pushed my car out of the driveway instead of starting it. I remember how cold the air felt, how heavy the car seemed as I strained to move it. I coasted down the street in silence until I was far enough away that my parents wouldn't hear the engine. Only then did I start the car and drive. The roads were empty. Winter nights have a way of feeling hollow, like the world has paused. Streetlights passed slowly. My hands were tight on the steering wheel, knuckles white. I kept replaying her voice in my head, trying to guess what had happened, trying not to imagine the worst. When I got to the address, my stomach dropped. It was a normal house. Quiet, dark, no lights on, no signs of a party. I parked down the street, afraid to pull into the driveway. I didn't want to draw attention. I didn't know who might be watching. After a moment, the front door opened, just enough for someone to slip out. It was her. She was trying to move silently, like she was afraid of being heard. When she reached the car and got in, I finally saw her clearly under the dim interior light. She was naked. Her makeup was smeared down her face from crying. Her hair was tangled, matted like she hadn't slept properly or had been handled roughly. She looked smaller somehow, folded in on herself, arms crossed over her body, as if she could disappear. I didn't say anything. I just put the car in drive and pulled away. She grabbed the clothes I had brought and started putting them on with shaking hands. I kept my eyes on the road, pretending I couldn't see how badly she was shaking, pretending this was just another ride home. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't get enough air. I asked her what happened, gently, carefully, afraid that one wrong word would break her completely. All she managed to say was that she had gone to her boyfriend's birthday party. Then she stopped talking. After a long silence, she said she woke up like this. No memory of how she got there. No memory of what happened. She said she woke up in the middle of the room. Everyone was there. His friends, him, all of them naked. That was all she could say before her voice cracked, and she shut down completely. I didn't ask anything else. I didn't push. I didn't know what to say, and I didn't want to make it worse. I just drove. The ride felt endless. The heater hummed quietly. The road stretched out in front of us, empty and dark. She stared out the window, silent, arms wrapped around herself. I wanted to say something comforting, something that would make it better, but I didn't know how. I was 16. I barely understood my own feelings, let alone something like this. I dropped her off at her house and waited until she was inside. She didn't look back. She didn't wave. She just disappeared through the door. I drove home in silence. I pushed the car back into the driveway the same way I'd pushed it out, heart pounding, every sound feeling too loud. I crawled back into bed 2 hours before my alarm was set to go off for school. I stared at the ceiling till morning. We never spoke about it again. At school, everything was the same on the surface. She smiled, she laughed, she acted normal. I followed her lead. I didn't bring it up. She didn't either. It was like an unspoken agreement that whatever happened that night would stay locked away. At the time, I didn't fully understand what I had been part of. I knew it was bad. I knew it was wrong. But I didn't have the language or the life experience to grasp the weight of it. I was just relieved she was safe, that she had called me, that I had been able to help in some small way. Years passed. Life moved on the way it always does. We graduated. We went our separate ways. Social media came and went in different forms. I saw her life unfold from a distance. She got married. She had kids. She seemed happy, or at least she looked happy in photos. We didn't talk anymore, but every now and then I would check her profile, just to see that she was still there. 17 years later, everything feels different. I have kids now. I have a daughter. She is the light of my world, the kind of love that rewires your entire brain, the kind of love that makes you suddenly understand fear in a way you never did before. Now, when I think about that night, it hits me all at once. I think about how young she was, how vulnerable, how many people failed her that night. I think about how easily it could have gone worse, how easily she could have never made that call, never gotten out. I think about the boys in that room, about the silence afterward, about how no one faced consequences. I think about how she trusted me enough to call. That's the part that breaks me every time. Out of everyone she knew, she called me. The quiet kid, the nerd, the one person she believed would come without asking questions, without expecting anything in return. And I did. But now, with the perspective of time, I wish I could have done more. I wish I had known what to say, who to tell, how to protect her better. I know now that freezing, staying silent, pretending it never happened is common. I know now how complicated trauma is, how survival sometimes looks like moving on without looking back. But knowing that doesn't make it hurt less. When I look at my daughter, I think about how the world can change in a single night, how trust can be weaponized, how silence can protect the wrong people. I think about how easily something like that can be buried, normalized, erased. I don't know how that night shaped her life. I don't know what she remembers or what she's chosen to forget. I don't know what scars she carries quietly. I just hope she's okay. I hope she found peace. I hope she found safety. I still check her Facebook sometimes. Not out of obsession, just reassurance. She smiles in pictures with her kids. She looks strong. She looks present. I hope that means something. Some memories don't fully surface until years later, when life gives you the context to understand them. This is one of those memories. It didn't feel like horror at the time. It felt confusing, urgent, strange. Now it feels heavy. Now it feels like a reminder of how close danger can be, how young we all were, and how much responsibility we carry for each other, even when we don't realize it yet. I can't tell this story without crying anymore, not because of fear, but because of love. Because I know now what was at stake that night. Because I know now how easily a life can be broken, and how rare it is to be given a chance to escape. And because somewhere out there is a woman who trusted a 16-year-old kid enough to call him in the middle of the night, and that trust still feels like something I need to honor, even all these years later. In my own personal life, I've had more than one experience that still doesn't feel real when I think about it, even now. These are the kinds of stories that sound exaggerated or made up when you say them out loud, but they aren't. They happened around me, to people I knew well, people I grew up with, people who felt normal and familiar at the time. Looking back, it feels like violence and addiction were always closer than I realized, quietly shaping lives in the background. My childhood best friend grew up in a complicated family. Alcohol was everywhere in her life from a very young age. It wasn't unusual. It was just part of the environment. Her grandfather was a heavy drinker, and so was his girlfriend. They had a volatile relationship, the kind that was loud and messy and unpredictable. But again, it was treated as normal by the people around them. Fights, breakups, disappearances, reconciliations, it all blended together. At some point, the girlfriend disappeared. She didn't show up anymore. No one heard from her, but because of her history with addiction, her family didn't immediately panic. She had disappeared before, sometimes for weeks, sometimes longer. She would resurface eventually, usually worse off than before, but alive. So when she vanished this time, people assumed it was more of the same. No missing person report was filed. No urgent search. Life just went on. As far as anyone knew, she had taken off again. About a year passed. During that time, my friend's grandfather died. His death didn't raise many questions either. He was an alcoholic, older, and had lived a hard life. When he passed, it felt like the end of a long, unhealthy chapter, rather than a shocking event. Family members started sorting through his belongings, dealing with loose ends, trying to figure out what went where. One of those loose ends was his car. The car had been parked about a block away from his house for a long time. It was still in his name. My childhood friend had been told she would get it. She was counting on it. Not because it was valuable, but because it felt like one of the few tangible things she would receive. When her aunt suddenly claimed the car instead, it caused a huge argument. My friend was furious. She felt cheated, dismissed, pushed aside like she always had been in that family. In a moment of anger and pettiness, she decided to cause problems. If she couldn't have the car, she wasn't going to make it easy for anyone else to get it either. Since the car was still legally in her grandfather's name, she called a tow company and reported it so it would be towed. Her thinking was simple. If the car got towed, her aunt would have to deal with paperwork, fees, and delays. It wasn't about justice or ownership anymore. It was about spite. What happened next was something no one could have predicted. One of the guys working at the tow company happened to know the aunt. Small towns work like that. People overlap in unexpected ways. When he realized whose car it was and that the owner had recently died, he decided to do her a favor. He called her and told her the car was about to be towed, giving her a chance to come get it first. She rushed over to pick it up. When she opened the car, she noticed something strange right away. There were large plastic storage totes sitting in the back seat. 2 or 3 of them. That alone was odd, but not alarming. People leave all kinds of things in cars. What made her pause was how carefully sealed they were. For reasons no one fully understands, she decided to open them right there. Inside the totes were vacuum-sealed bags. Multiple bags, all different sizes. The plastic wasn't clear. It had that frosted, cloudy look that makes it hard to see what's inside. She could tell whatever was in them was dark in color, but she couldn't tell what it actually was. At first, she didn't jump to the worst conclusion. Her mind went somewhere more familiar. She thought it might be meat. Her father had hunted before. People sometimes transported deer meat like that. The smell hadn't hit her yet, and she tried to rationalize what she was seeing. Still, something felt off. The bags were too carefully packed, too many of them, and they were sitting in the back seat of a car, not a freezer. She opened one bag. The smell hit her immediately. It was overwhelming, foul in a way that didn't match spoiled food. At first, she tried to convince herself it was just badly gone meat, something left too long in the heat. But when she actually looked inside, the truth was impossible to deny. It was a human hand. She didn't touch anything else. She didn't open another bag. She stepped away from the car and called the police. When officers arrived, they took control of the scene immediately. The totes were removed. The car was seized. The aunt didn't get the car. My friend didn't get the car. No one did. What was left of the girlfriend was found inside those bags. The investigation confirmed what no one had suspected while the grandfather was alive. He had killed her. He had dismembered her. He had stored her remains in his car. And because he was already dead, there would be no arrest, no trial, no confession. The case ended almost as soon as it began. There were no answers beyond the basic facts, no explanation of what happened that night, no chance for accountability, just the sudden, horrifying realization that someone everyone had known and tolerated had committed an unspeakable crime and lived with it for a year without anyone knowing. The family didn't talk about it much afterward. It was too disturbing, too shameful, too heavy. People moved on the way they always do, by not looking too closely at what they'd been living alongside all along. For my friend, it was just another layer of trauma added to an already unstable life. Years later, she would become involved in something just as dark. By that point, she was deep into addiction herself. Meth had taken over her life. The person I had grown up with, laughed with, trusted, was barely recognizable. Her priorities had narrowed to one thing: getting high. Everything else, including morality and safety, came second. One night, she was with 2 other addicts, a couple she had been using with. They were driving around, restless, paranoid, desperate. The kind of desperation that convinces you that you're entitled to whatever you want, no matter who gets hurt. They decided they needed money so they could get more drugs. They talked themselves into robbing someone, as if it were a simple solution. My friend was driving. The girlfriend sat in the passenger seat. The boyfriend was in the back. They pulled up to someone, a man they thought would be an easy target. The man got into the back seat. Almost immediately, things went wrong. The boyfriend tried to rob him, but the man was armed. He pulled out a gun and shot the boyfriend in the head. Then he ran. It all happened fast. There was no dramatic buildup, no chance to rethink. Just a sudden explosion of violence, and then silence. The boyfriend was still alive, but barely. Instead of calling for help, instead of stopping and trying to save him, my friend and the girlfriend panicked. Fear and self-preservation took over. They drove to a hospital, but they didn't go inside. They didn't ask for doctors. They didn't explain what happened. They pushed him out of the car and fled. That decision sealed their fate. It took a few months for the police to piece everything together. Witnesses, cameras, timelines. Eventually, they identified both women. They were arrested and charged. The story came out in fragments, ugly and chaotic, exactly the way it had happened. My friend went to prison. She served around 5 to 7 years, depending on how you count it. When she got out, she was older, worn down, carrying the weight of everything she had been part of. We don't talk anymore. Life moved us in different directions long before that. But I still think about her sometimes. I think about how her life was shaped by addiction long before she ever touched drugs herself. How violence was normalized in her family. How secrets were buried instead of confronted. How easy it was for her to slide into a world where human life stopped feeling sacred. I think about how close all of this was to me, how easily I could have been pulled into something similar if circumstances had been slightly different. These aren't stories you forget, huh? They don't fade. They sit quietly in the back of your mind, surfacing when you least expect them. When someone talks about true crime like it's entertainment. When someone says they never saw it coming. When someone assumes monsters look different from regular people. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they look like a drunk old man everyone tolerated. Sometimes they look like a friend you grew up with. Sometimes they're already dead before the truth comes out. And sometimes they walk free again after serving their time, trying to rebuild something from the wreckage. What stays with me the most isn't just the violence. It's how ordinary it all felt at the time, how many warning signs were ignored, how many people knew something was wrong but didn't act, because it was easier not to. These things didn't happen in dark alleys or distant cities. They happened in familiar places, around people who were known, loved, or at least accepted. That's what makes it so unsettling. It's not just that these things happened. It's that they happened quietly, surrounded by people who never imagined how bad it really was until it was far too late. The death of Hisashi Uchi is one of those stories that stays with you long after you first hear it. Not because it's dramatic in a cinematic way, but because it is slow, clinical, and relentlessly cruel. It forces you to confront an uncomfortable truth about medicine, technology, and human limits. Sometimes the ability to keep someone alive does not mean that we should. Hisashi Uchi was a young man working at a nuclear fuel processing plant in Japan. He was not a scientist in charge of designing reactors or setting safety policy. He was a worker doing his job in an environment that, in hindsight, was dangerously unprepared for the risks involved. The plant had a history of poor safety practices, cost-cutting, and shortcuts that violated established nuclear safety protocols. These were not small oversights. In nuclear work, small mistakes can have enormous consequences. On the day of the accident, Uchi and 2 co-workers were tasked with preparing a batch of nuclear fuel. The proper procedure required automated systems and strict limits on how much enriched uranium could be handled at once. Instead, workers were instructed to mix the solution manually, pouring it into a precipitation tank using buckets. This method was faster and cheaper, but it bypassed multiple layers of safety designed to prevent a criticality accident. A criticality accident happens when a nuclear chain reaction becomes self-sustaining outside of a controlled reactor environment. In simple terms, the nuclear material reaches a point where atoms begin splitting rapidly, releasing massive amounts of radiation in a very short time. This is not an explosion like a bomb, But the radiation output can be devastating to anyone nearby. When Uchi and his co-workers poured too much enriched uranium into the tank, they unknowingly crossed that threshold. There was a sudden blue flash caused by ionized air and Cherenkov radiation, a telltale sign of intense radiation. Alarms went off. The room filled with invisible danger. Ouchie was standing closest to the tank when the reaction occurred. He absorbed an unimaginably high dose of radiation in seconds. It is believed that he received the highest dose of radiation ever survived by a human without dying immediately. To put this into perspective, radiation exposure is measured in sieverts. A dose of around 4 to 5 sieverts is often fatal without treatment. 10 sieverts is almost always fatal. Ouchie's estimated dose was far beyond that, many times higher than what the human body can tolerate. It was a dose that should have killed him almost instantly, but it didn't. Instead, his body began a slow process of collapse that would last 81 days. He was rushed to a hospital and placed under the care of specialists. Very quickly, doctors realized that this was not a case of treating radiation sickness and hoping for recovery. His cells had been catastrophically damaged at the most fundamental level. Radiation doesn't just burn skin or make you feel sick. It shreds DNA. It destroys the instructions that tell cells how to repair themselves, divide, and function. In Ouchie's case, his chromosomes were so badly damaged that his cells could no longer regenerate. This was especially devastating for tissues that rely on constant cell renewal, such as the skin, the lining of the intestines, and the bone marrow. At first, he was conscious. He could speak. He understood what had happened to him in a general sense. As the days passed, the physical effects became more severe and more horrifying. His white blood cell count dropped to nearly 0. This meant his immune system was essentially gone. Even the most harmless bacteria could become lethal. He had to be kept in an extremely sterile environment, isolated from almost all human contact. His skin began to fail. Radiation burns are not like thermal burns. They don't always appear immediately, and they don't heal normally. Ouchie's skin started to blister, peel, and slough off. Large areas of his body lost their protective barrier entirely. Fluids leaked from his tissues. Doctors struggled to prevent infections and dehydration. But his body could not maintain itself. Internally, things were even worse. The lining of his digestive tract was destroyed. This caused severe bleeding, constant diarrhea, and unbearable pain. His body could no longer absorb nutrients properly. He was fed intravenously. But even that became difficult as his veins weakened and collapsed. At one point, doctors attempted a bone marrow transplant, hoping it might help restore some immune function. Under normal circumstances, this could be a life-saving procedure. In Ouchie's case, it failed. His body simply could not support the process. The damage was too extensive, too deep. Throughout all of this, he was kept alive by machines and aggressive medical intervention. Blood transfusions were given constantly. Pain management was attempted, though it is widely believed that no amount of medication could fully relieve what he was experiencing. His organs began to fail one by one. There were moments when his heart stopped. Doctors resuscitated him. There were moments when his condition clearly crossed the line where recovery was no longer possible. His body was no longer healing. It was disintegrating. And yet, treatment continued. This is the part of the story that troubles so many people. For 81 days, a team of highly skilled doctors worked tirelessly to keep him alive. From a technical standpoint, it was an extraordinary medical effort. From a human standpoint, it raises deeply uncomfortable questions. Reports suggest that Ouchie himself asked to be allowed to die. He was in constant pain. He was aware enough to understand that his condition was not improving. But at the time, withdrawing life support was not a straightforward or widely accepted option in Japan, especially in such a high-profile case. There was also immense pressure to do everything possible to push the limits of medicine, to see how long life could be sustained. So they continued. His skin continued to peel away. His internal bleeding worsened. His organs failed. His body swelled with fluids. He lost the ability to speak. Eventually, he lost consciousness. What remained was a body being artificially sustained, while the person he had been was slipping further and further away. After 81 days, his heart finally stopped for the last time. The official cause of death was multiple organ failure due to radiation exposure. He was still a young man. The tragedy of Hisashi Uchi is not just that he died. It's how he died. Slowly. Painfully. Publicly, in a sense. His suffering became a case study, a grim example cited in discussions about radiation safety, medical ethics, and workplace responsibility. The accident itself was preventable. It happened because of ignored safety rules, inadequate training, and a workplace culture that prioritized efficiency over human life. Auchi did not choose to take that risk. It was imposed on him. The medical response, while technically impressive, forces us to ask where the line should be drawn. At what point does treatment stop being about saving a life and start being about prolonging suffering? When the body has lost the ability to heal, when recovery is impossible, what is the moral obligation of doctors? There are no easy answers. Some argue that everything possible had to be done, that every moment of life has value, regardless of condition. Others see Auchi's prolonged suffering as a failure of compassion, a case where the fear of letting go outweighed the duty to relieve pain. What is clear is that his experience was one of the worst fates imaginable. Radiation is especially terrifying because it attacks you from the inside out. There is no visible enemy, no clear wound to treat and heal. It turns the body against itself, dismantling it piece by piece while consciousness can remain intact, at least for a time. His story also changed how people talk about nuclear safety in Japan. It exposed how dangerous shortcuts can be in high-risk industries. It showed that disasters don't always come in the form of explosions or immediate death. Sometimes they come quietly, leaving one person to bear the full weight of a system's failures. When people say that sometimes saving a life isn't worth it, this is often the story they think of, not because life lacks value, but because suffering does too. Hisashi Uchi did not die quickly. He did not fade peacefully. He endured something that no human body was ever meant to endure, and he did so because of decisions made by others, both before and after the accident. It is a tragic story, not just of radiation and medicine, but of responsibility, of how progress and technology demand respect, of how ethics must evolve alongside capability, and of how the goal of medicine should never be reduced to keeping a heart beating at any cost. Sometimes, the most humane choice is knowing when to stop. His story remains a stark reminder of that truth and of the terrible price paid when we forget it. My girlfriend told me this story about someone she knew from high school, and the more I've thought about it over time, the more disturbing it becomes. Not in a loud, obvious way, but in a quiet, lingering way that messes with your sense of safety and reality. It's one of those stories where everything starts normal, even pleasant, and then slips into something that feels unreal, even though it isn't. This guy went to Italy on holiday with his family. Nothing unusual about that. Just a family vacation, sightseeing, eating good food, doing what tourists do. They were staying in a town with narrow streets, old buildings, the kind of place where evenings stretch on and dinner is a long, relaxed event instead of something rushed. One night, they all went out to dinner together at a local restaurant. They ate, talked, laughed, and drank. Everything was normal. There was no argument, no tension, no sign that anything bad was about to happen. At some point during the meal, he said he was going to step outside for a cigarette. And that's it. That's the last normal moment. He got up from the table, walked out of the restaurant, and never came back. At first, his family didn't panic. They assumed he was just taking his time, maybe chatting with someone outside, maybe enjoying the night air. When a few minutes passed, they started to get mildly annoyed. When more time passed, that annoyance turned into confusion. They went outside to look for him. He wasn't there. They checked nearby. Still nothing. Now concern started to creep in. This wasn't like him. He wouldn't just disappear without saying anything, especially in a foreign country. They went back inside, waited a bit longer, then went out again. They walked up and down the street. No sign of him. No answers from anyone nearby. No one had seen where he went. By the time dinner ended, fear had fully set in. They went back to the hotel, hoping maybe he'd gone there ahead of them for some reason. He wasn't there. His room was untouched. His phone wasn't answering. They searched the hotel, asked staff, asked other guests. Nothing. That night was chaos for the family. They barely slept. They kept replaying the evening over and over, trying to pinpoint when something went wrong. They asked themselves the same questions repeatedly. Did he seem drunk? Did anyone strange approach him? Did he mention feeling unwell? There were no answers, just the growing realization that someone had vanished in a foreign country without a trace. The next day, they contacted the police. Reports were filed. Descriptions were given. The last known location was the restaurant. Officers searched the area, questioned people, checked hospitals, checked jails. Nothing came up. No CCTV footage that explained anything. No witnesses who saw him leave with someone. It was as if he had stepped outside and then ceased to exist. Hours turned into a full day. Then another. 3 days passed. His family was beyond panic at that point. They were terrified. They started preparing themselves mentally for the worst possibilities. Because when someone disappears without explanation, your mind goes to dark places whether you want it to or not. Kidnapping, murder, an accident that hadn't been discovered yet. Every scenario felt unbearable. Then, on the third day, something happened that made the entire situation even more surreal. He woke up. He woke up near the same restaurant where he had gone out for a cigarette. Not in a hospital bed, not in some unfamiliar place, just nearby, as if he had simply fallen asleep on the street or in an alley and slept for a very long time. To him, no time had passed. In his mind, he had stepped outside the restaurant, blacked out, and then woken up. That was it. He was confused, but not panicked. He had no memory of anything happening in between. He didn't feel like he had been missing for 3 days. He didn't feel like anything was wrong. He assumed he had gotten drunk, maybe passed out somewhere stupid, and that his family would be annoyed but relieved to see him. He walked back to the hotel like nothing had happened. You can imagine the reaction when he walked through the door. His family didn't know whether to cry, scream, or collapse. They were furious, relieved, shaken, and confused all at the same time. They asked him where he had been, what happened, who he was with, why he didn't call. He couldn't answer any of it. He genuinely didn't know. He told them he remembered going out for a cigarette and then waking up. To him, it felt like maybe a short blackout. He had no pain, no obvious injuries, no signs of trauma that he could see. He didn't even feel particularly sick, just confused about why everyone was so upset. They told him he had been gone for 3 days. He didn't believe them at first. It took time for that reality to sink in. 3 days of his life were completely gone. No memories, no sense of time passing, nothing. That alone was disturbing, but at least he was alive. At least he was back. For a brief moment, it felt like the nightmare was over. Later that same day, after things had calmed down slightly, he went to take a shower. This is where everything takes a sharp turn into something far darker. While showering, he felt something strange on his back. A tightness. A sensation that didn't feel normal. He reached back and felt it with his hand. Then he looked in the mirror. There was a large scar across his back. Not a scratch, not a bruise. A proper surgical scar. Clean. Healed enough that it wasn't bleeding, but fresh enough to be unmistakable. The kind of scar that doesn't come from an accident or a fall. The kind that comes from being cut open deliberately. He screamed. He ran out of the bathroom in a panic, shouting for his family. When they saw the scar, the mood shifted instantly. Relief vanished. Confusion turned into horror. This wasn't a simple blackout. This wasn't a drunken mistake. Something had been done to him. They rushed him to a nearby hospital. Doctors examined him, took him seriously immediately, and ordered imaging, x-rays, scans, tests. They didn't waste time. Whatever had happened, it was clear this wasn't normal. The results confirmed everyone's worst fear. He was missing a kidney, not damaged, not injured, gone, removed surgically, cleanly, professionally. The doctors explained that the incision, the way it was done, the lack of infection, all pointed to a controlled surgical procedure. This wasn't something done in a panic or by amateurs. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. They removed the kidney, closed him up, and somehow kept him alive and stable long enough to return him to the exact area where he had been taken. That's when the realization hit. He hadn't wandered off. He hadn't passed out and slept for 3 days. He had been kidnapped, drugged, operated on, and then dumped back where he started. The explanation that made the most sense, and the one doctors quietly acknowledged, was organized crime. Illegal organ trafficking. The kind of operation that targets tourists because they are harder to track, less likely to have local support, and easier to disappear temporarily without immediate answers. The idea is horrifying when you think about it for more than a few seconds. Someone watched him leave the restaurant. Someone decided he was a good target. Someone made him disappear without a struggle, loud enough to be noticed. Someone kept him unconscious for days. Someone removed one of his organs. And then someone put him back exactly where he'd been taken. Alive, but permanently altered. The precision of it is what makes it terrifying. They didn't leave him in a ditch. They didn't kill him. They didn't even leave obvious signs at first glance. If he hadn't noticed the scar, if he hadn't gone to the hospital, he might have lived for some time before realizing something was seriously wrong. And he had no memory of any of it. That's what sticks with me the most. 3 days of his life erased. No pain remembered. No fear remembered. Just a gap where something unspeakable happened. After that, the vacation ended immediately. There was no salvaging it. His family returned home as soon as possible. Police reports were made. But there was little that could be done. There were no suspects, no witnesses, no trail to follow. Organized crime operations like that don't leave loose ends you can easily trace. He survived, but survival came with a cost. Living with one kidney is possible, but it's not nothing. It changes your life. You have to be careful. You have to monitor your health. You have to live knowing that part of your body was taken from you without consent, without warning, by people you will never see or face. Psychologically, it was even worse. He struggled with the missing time, with the fact that his body had been violated while his mind was completely absent, with the knowledge that at any point he could have died on an operating table in a place he would never remember seeing. It changed how he viewed travel, how he viewed strangers, how he viewed safety. Before that, the idea of going out for a cigarette during a family dinner felt harmless. After that, it felt reckless in hindsight, even though it wasn't. That's how trauma works. It rewrites your past, making normal choices feel dangerous once you know how wrong things can go. People who hear this story sometimes try to rationalize it away. They say it sounds like an urban legend. They say it's exaggerated. They say it's too clean, too precise, too cinematic to be real. But the scar was real. The missing kidney was real. The hospital records were real. And the 3 missing days were real. What makes it truly unsettling is how quiet it all was. No screaming, no chase, no dramatic rescue. Just a man stepping outside for a cigarette, and then waking up days later, altered forever, with no memory of what was done to him. It forces you to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes terrible things don't come with warning signs. Sometimes danger doesn't feel dangerous until it's already over. Sometimes you don't even remember being hurt, and sometimes the world is far colder and more organized in its cruelty than we want to believe. That's why this story sticks with me. Not because it's flashy or dramatic, but because it shows how easily a normal moment can turn into something unimaginable. One step outside, one cigarette, and a life permanently changed. Every time I think about it, I imagine how many people walk away from restaurants, hotels, bars, and cafes every day, completely unaware of how thin the line is between safety and disappearance. He was lucky, if that's even the right word. He came back alive. But a part of him never did. Look, if you're still watching, you already know what this channel is. No jump scares, no fake drama, just real stories about real people who survived things most of us can't even imagine. And that's scarier than any movie could ever be. If you want more of this raw, unfiltered truth, told the way it deserves to be told, subscribe to Lacuna Noir. We're not here to waste your time. We're here to tell the stories that actually matter. Thanks for listening. Now go get some sleep, if you can.